Chapter 1. The Abandoned Trail. Laura Miller had always believed the mountains carried a quiet promise of peace, but that autumn evening in 2011 stripped the promise away. The Appalachian ridges loomed heavy against a dimming sky, their slopes cloaked in rust-red leaves that whispered restlessly beneath the rising wind. She had begun the hike surrounded by the familiar rhythm of footsteps and the occasional burst of laughter, comforted by the sense of companionship. Yet the cadence shifted without warning. Those she trusted surged ahead, their silhouettes shrinking into the distance until branches swallowed them whole, leaving her isolated on the narrow trail. The path beneath her boots twisted like a pale scar etched through the forest, uneven and snagged with roots that reached like skeletal hands eager to ensnare the unwary. Moss slickened the stones, and fallen leaves created a deceptive carpet that concealed treacherous holes. The air thickened with moisture, the mingled scents of damp bark, rotting foliage, and distant rain filling her lungs with a heaviness that dragged against her resolve. Each gust carried a sharper edge, slicing through her thin jacket, reminding her how fragile warmth could be when daylight faded. Her steps slowed as the truth pressed heavier against her mind. She was not simply lagging behind. She had been left. The thought settled into her chest with a weight greater than the pack on her shoulders. At first, she strained to listen for familiar voices, the comforting echo of her companions ahead. But the forest gave her nothing. Only the creak of bending branches, the shuffle of restless animals in the undergrowth, and the hollow moan of wind weaving its way through narrow hollows of stone. Her pulse beat a faster rhythm, though she tried to force each step into calm deliberation, clinging to the illusion of control. The more she pressed on, the more the wilderness closed its grip around her. Above, the sky shifted from dull gold to bruised purple, clouds gathering like a dark tide. The trees leaned inward, ribs of an ancient cage, their branches tangling into a lattice that choked the last scraps of light. The ground beneath her boots seemed to cool with every breath, leaching warmth into the hungry soil. With each mile, the trail lost its identity as a route meant for travelers and became instead a corridor of abandonment. Her ears filled with silence so oppressive it rang louder than sound itself. Every snapped twig beneath her boots cracked like a verdict delivered in a courtroom of shadows. She stopped once, clutching the strap of her pack, and understood with chilling clarity that this was no accident. The people she trusted had cast her aside, her faith in them discarded as easily as a broken branch swept from the trail. Darkness thickened, not in swift descent, but in slow, deliberate layers. The ridgeline swallowed the last shimmers of the sun, bleeding light into obscurity. A mist crept low across the undergrowth, veiling the trail in ghostly swirls that blurred the line between ground and air. Laura felt the cold wrap its fingers around her arms and spine, tugging her deeper into the realization of her solitude. What had once promised adventure, now twisted into a warning carved into the wilderness itself. Each bend in the trail carried no hint of safety, only the threat of further isolation. By the time the horizon surrendered tonight, Laura knew she was utterly and irreversibly alone, her trust shattered, and her path transformed into an omen, written in the language of silence and shadows. Chapter 2. The cold that stole her breath. The mountains did not need ice or snow to punish her. The air hovered at 50 degrees, a temperature that in safety might have felt harmless, but in the exposed wilderness it became a slow and deliberate sentence. Rain began as a thin veil of mist, threading down through the canopy in a steady drizzle. Each droplet swelled on the edge of a leaf before releasing, falling with unrelenting rhythm onto her head, her shoulders, her trembling hands. What began as discomfort grew into torment as the moisture seeped through fabric and skin, crawling across her body with merciless persistence. The mountain wind was sharper than any blade. It slipped beneath her jacket, clawed through the gaps at her cuffs and collar, and chased the wetness deeper until every layer of clothing clung like icy second skin. Warmth was siphoned away breath by breath, minute by minute. Each gust seemed purposeful, as if the wilderness itself were conspiring to strip her of the fragile defenses she carried against its ancient indifference. Her jaw locked against itself, teeth rattling so violently the sound rang like brittle glass struck together. The chatter echoed in her skull, metallic and cruel. Her fingers, once nimble, stiffened into useless claws, flesh and bone transformed into unyielding wood. She tried to flex them, to summon motion, but the signals from her brain traveled too slowly, as though frozen mid-journey. Each breath scalded her lungs with cold, air turning sharp as shards of glass that scraped from throat to chest, leaving her gasping. She remembered warnings she had once dismissed as exaggeration. Hypothermia could take hold even in mild temperatures. 50 degrees was survivable in comfort, but paired with wet clothes, exposure, and wind, it became a death trap invisible until its jaws closed tight. Her body still resisted. At first it fought with furious determination, shivering in violent spasms that shook her bones. It was the body's last primitive machine, shaking itself in desperate attempts to spark fire from within. Muscles jerked and contracted uncontrollably, waves of tremors cascading until she felt drained. Her energy bled into the damp soil. Her legs quivered beneath her weight, refusing command. The trembling rhythm grew disjointed, making her stumble across roots and stones until finally she sagged against the slick trunk of a moss-covered tree. The forest enclosed her with its damp gray silence, watching her with the same distant indifference as it had for centuries, as if her struggle were nothing more than another storm passing through. Then came the change, sudden and treacherous. The shivering that once rattled her teeth eased. At first she thought it was relief, a gift from the night. But the truth surfaced quickly. Her body was surrendering. Heat bloomed faintly in her chest, soft and deceptive. It spread outward like honey poured across her limbs, coaxing her into stillness. Her arms tingled, as if warmed by an invisible fire. Her legs softened as though they were wrapped in a heavy blanket. For the first time since she had been abandoned, fear dulled, fading into a quiet calm. Her eyelids sagged, too heavy to hold against the lure of rest. The storm no longer seemed hostile, but almost gentle, the wind carrying a lullaby that urged her to sink against the damp ground and let go. It felt like mercy, but it was not. Beneath the fragile warmth lurked the truth. This was the mountain's final cruelty. The cold had tricked her into yielding, easing her resistance so it could finish its theft. The wilderness drew her into its rhythm, a rhythm not of survival, but of silence. Breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat, the thief worked patiently, determined to strip her of the last fragments of life she carried. The forest did not rage, nor roar, nor punish with violence. It simply waited, taking piece after piece of her strength, until there would be nothing left but quiet. Chapter 3. The Wolf in the Mountains. The forest had blurred into fragments of sound and shadow when the sharp crack of a branch cut through the fog of her failing senses. Laura's head lifted weakly, her vision swimming in and out of focus, and through the shifting silhouettes of skeletal trees, a shape began to take form. It moved with an ease that did not belong to man. No stumbling, no hurried pace, but a measured grace that resonated with the pulse of the wilderness itself. Out of the dim, dissolving light stepped a wolf, broad-shouldered, massive in frame, heavy with muscle beneath a thick pelt of coarse gray fur that shimmered faintly in the dying glow of dusk. Its eyes found her immediately. Twin orbs of amber caught the fading sun, glowing like molten fire in a furnace long tended by unseen hands. The gaze was direct, unwavering, and it bore an ancient weight that seemed to press against the air itself. The restless wind slackened as if cowed by that stare. For Laura, frozen by cold and weakness, the sight did not summon the terror she once believed inevitable. No frantic surge of panic electrified her veins. No scream climbed the ladder of her throat. Instead, a quiet surrender unfurled within her chest, calm and unresisting, as though the decision of her survival had already been made and she had been excluded from the council. The animal stood in still poise, its massive body framed by the shadows of oaks and maples, breath rising in pale clouds into the cooling air. Each inhalation was steady, every exhalation deliberate, as though time itself had slowed to accommodate the creature's presence. The forest, moments before restless with groaning trees and rustling undergrowth, hushed into reverent silence. Even the branches above ceased their clattering dance, their skeletal arms frozen mid-gesture. It was as if the entire wilderness had paused to acknowledge its sentinel. Predator and prey, bound together in fragile silence, studied one another across a gulf, not of distance, but of meaning. Laura's strength had long since bled away into the earth. Her body was incapable of movement, her muscles numb and unwilling, her mind drifting between awareness and surrender. Yet the wolf did not advance, did not close the short space that separated them. It tilted its head slightly, as if considering her not as quarry, but as something else entirely. Then, with an unhurried motion, it lowered itself onto its haunches, curling its great body into a position of patient repose. The massive frame sank into the damp earth, not as a looming executioner, but as a witness who had come to mark the moment. Time became fluid in its company. Laura's heart, which had been faltering into irregular beats, thudded again with fragile rhythm, louder in her ears than the sigh of wind. Each beat felt less like a countdown to an inevitable end, and more like a fragile vow, tethering her to the present for another breath, another minute, another hour. The wolf's stillness was not comforting in any human sense. It did not radiate warmth or safety. Instead, it radiated endurance. Its mere presence carved into the air, the undeniable reminder that survival was possible, that life was still claimed in this unforgiving place. Where man had betrayed her and left her to perish, the mountain had sent its guardian, cloaked not in armor or light, but in gray fur and silence. The beast kept its vigil as the shadows stretched long and the night rose around them, holding watch until the fragile line of dawn would split the horizon. Chapter 4. The Voice of the Wild. The night stretched into an eternity, each moment drawn out by silence that pressed against her chest and the unrelenting pulse of cold that crawled beneath her skin. The mountains seemed to hold the darkness more deeply than anywhere else she had known. Here, even the sky conspired with the forest to conceal the stars, leaving only the oppressive shroud of blackness that smothered the ridges. Laura lay motionless, her body wedged between shivers and numbness, consciousness flickering like a failing flame. The thin boundary between life and surrender blurred, and the only tether that kept her anchored was the faint rhythm of movement nearby, the soft, deliberate crunch of paws pressing into wet soil. The wolf slipped in and out of vision like a phantom written into the night. One moment its form dissolved into the dense shadows, swallowed by trunks and undergrowth, and the next, it reemerged with the slow patience of a sentinel. It did not pace in agitation. It circled with intent, with the quiet assurance of something that had claimed its place as guardian. Each reappearance was a reminder that she was not entirely alone, though the thought carried more mystery than comfort. Time lost its edges. Minutes melted into hours, hours into something shapeless. She could no longer measure the night by anything but the shifting breaths of the forest. At times the woods fell into complete stillness, as though the world itself was holding its breath. At others, sudden gusts swept through, rattling branches until they showered droplets in fine curtains that pattered across the soil. Through it all, the wolf remained. Its steady presence reminded her that life still moved and watched, even if her own strength ebbed. Whenever her mind began to drift into nothingness, the glimmer of those eyes appeared again, golden reflections in the void, and she clung to that sight as if it carried a truth larger than survival. When the horizon softened into the faintest gray, the world stirred again. Dawn crept slowly, timidly, brushing the ridges with fragile light. The wolf rose, not hurriedly, but with the weight of ceremony. It stood tall, its frame outlined against the paling sky, and lifted its head toward the heavens. What followed shattered the stillness, the first long, resonant note of a howl. The sound rolled across the valley, low and mournful at its birth, but it climbed in power, layering itself until it no longer belonged to a single animal. It became the voice of the wilderness itself, ancient and commanding. The cry soared over slopes, spilled across ridgelines, and fractured into countless echoes that rebounded through hollows and ravines. It was less a call to kin than a proclamation, a sound that demanded to be heard by every living thing within reach. To Laura, the howl pierced deeper than instinct. It felt like a declaration that the mountains would not conspire in silence, that her abandonment would not remain hidden beneath the trees. The wolf had spoken into the world, and the world would now know she was here. It was not an invitation to despair, but an insistence that her presence mattered, that she was not yet erased. Slowly, the wolf lowered its head, the last notes of its cry still trembling in the air. It stepped forward along the trail with purpose, each paw pressing into the softened soil with enough weight to leave sharp, distinct impressions. After several strides, it halted and turned. Framed by the pale light of dawn, it looked back at her. The gesture carried the weight of expectation, as though it asked her to rise and follow, to trust its chosen path. But her body was too heavy, limbs too unresponsive, her will locked beneath exhaustion. She could only watch, her gaze tethered to its shadowed form as it lingered one moment longer, before turning again toward the path. The trail of paw prints it left behind glistened dark in the wet earth, deliberate and clear. They were not random marks of a roaming beast, but a map, etched with instinct, a guide laid out for those who might come searching. The echoes of its howl still reverberated across the slopes, weaving through the ridges like threads of sound. And in that moment, Laura understood what had been given to her. The wild had spoken when she could not. The mountain, through its guardian, had granted her a voice at the very moment she was powerless to call for help. Chapter 5. The people who came along his path. By midday, the silence of the forest fractured. The stillness that had pressed down all morning now quivered with faint vibrations, threads of sound weaving themselves through the trees. At first, Laura believed them to be illusions born from exhaustion, tricks of a mind desperate to keep her tethered to life. The whispers of voices seemed too distant, too fragile, to be real. Yet they did not fade as dreams often do. They grew steadier, carried on the shifting air, layered with new textures, the rhythmic crunch of boots sinking into wet earth, the snap of branches forced aside, the occasional murmur pitched low with urgency. The tones were unmistakably human, firm but cautious, voices shaped by the weight of purpose. Laura forced her eyelids open, her vision blurring against the pale wash of light that now filtered through the thinning canopy. Every movement hurt, her lashes stuck together by cold tears, but she managed to catch flashes of color beyond the trees. Between the dark pillars of trunks, bright swatches appeared, reflective strips glinting, orange jackets shifting against the muted gray of the woods. Unlike the restless shapes of animals, these figures moved deliberately, sweeping the ground with practiced precision. The search party had entered the hollow. They carried themselves with the methodical focus of people who knew what they sought, but Laura sensed immediately that chance alone had not guided them. One figure broke away, crouching low over the sodden soil. He beckoned others with a sharp gesture. They gathered, their boots sinking deeper into the soft ground, their gloved fingers pointing toward the earth. Even from where she lay, she caught fragments of their astonishment. Voices carried in fragments on the breeze. Disbelief, surprise, repeated mention of tracks. Wolf tracks. The prints pressed into the mud were not scattered but deliberate, aligned like stepping stones laid out by some unseen hand. The rescuers followed them step by step, voices threaded with wonder at how clearly the trail seemed to draw them forward. Each mark in the soil became both a mystery and a guide, proof of a presence that had carved a map through the wilderness. Then they saw her. A ripple of recognition cut through the group, their voices sharpening into relief, into command. Figures closed in around her frail body, shadows moving fast but careful, their hands already reaching. A harsh beam of light swept across her pale face, too bright against her fading eyes, and one rescuer dropped to his knees beside her. His motions were practiced. Fingers at her neck searching for a pulse, an ear lowered to her lips, the careful pressure of hands assessing breath. He found her hand, limp and icy, and wrapped it tightly in his own gloved grasp. The pressure was firm, almost desperate, as though he could will his warmth into her veins by sheer force of touch. She felt the tremor of his grip, the solid reality of human connection after a night spent on the edge of silence. The sound of his voice reached her through the roar in her ears, muffled but insistent, words carrying reassurance. She could not answer. Her body betrayed her with weakness, her lips too heavy to part, her tongue too sluggish to form speech. Instead, her fingers curled faintly around his hand, the smallest gesture she could muster, yet one that bridged the abyss between them. Tears slid down her cheeks, hot against the chill of her skin. They were not born from the shock of survival, nor the relief of rescue alone. They came from deeper within, from the raw acknowledgement of what had led them to her. These men had come, yes, but not entirely by their own means. The paw prints pressed in mud, the echo of a howl that had rolled across ridges, the unseen sentinel who had stood watch while night threatened to claim her. All of it had woven the path that carried them to her side. As they lifted her onto a stretcher, as the forest filled with the clamor of voices and the steady rhythm of retreat, Laura's gratitude did not fasten itself to the human hands that bore her weight. It was directed toward the gray guardian of the mountains, the creature that had lingered when others abandoned her, the wild presence that had refused to let her vanish into silence. Chapter 6. Truth and Retribution. Recovery did not come quickly. Laura's body healed in fragments, skin knitting over wounds, muscles regaining their strength, but her mind lingered in the shadows of that mountain night. Weeks later, when she finally returned to Asheville, she carried not only scars, but a new clarity sharpened by survival. Almost immediately, questions rose from every corner. Neighbors asked, investigators pressed, reporters speculated. How had she been left alone? Why had her companions not raised the alarm the moment they noticed her missing? Why did their stories shift, depending on who was listening? At first, those who abandoned her spoke with confidence. Their words were smooth, rehearsed, delivered with the practiced ease of people who believed the lie had already taken root. They described the fog, the confusion of the trail, the misfortune of separation. Yet each time they retold the story, a seam split open. Details shifted like loose stones in a wall. They contradicted themselves, contradicted each other, contradicted the physical evidence carved into the soil of the mountains. Investigators retraced their steps through the ridges, comparing timelines with terrain. The forest floor revealed truths that no mouth could disguise. There were places they swore they had searched, yet no trace of their boots pressed into the mud. There were hours they accounted for poorly, gaps in their timeline that gaped like wounds. Witnesses emerged, campers, locals, hikers, who recalled overhearing conversations days earlier. Words laced with tension, quiet arguments that circled around money, ownership, and the division of land. The motive that surfaced was chilling in its simplicity: inheritance, wealth, and property that seemed easier to secure if Laura were no longer alive to claim them. The mask of innocence they wore soon began to rot. What they tried to frame as tragedy grew thinner with each passing day, becoming transparent enough for intent to shine through. Their confident voices faltered under questioning. Their faces, once steady, twitched with cracks of unease when documents and testimonies were laid before them. And through it all, Laura remained steady. She did not storm or rage, did not shout her accusations across the room. She offered only her testimony, spoken quietly but unflinchingly, a steady account of what she endured. It was her silence, more than her words, that carried weight. In the courtroom, she refused to perform grief or fury, refused to feed their narrative of chaos. Instead, she sat, composed, her stillness a mirror that forced others to see their own unease reflected back at them. The emptiness of her quiet became unbearable for those who sought to fill it with lies. It was as though the very absence of her anger magnified their guilt. Justice unfolded slowly, as justice often does. Hearings dragged into weeks, evidence mounted in careful stacks, and cross-examinations carved away at their flimsy defenses. Documents were read aloud, voices flat and stark, each page peeling back another layer of betrayal. Piece by piece, the truth dismantled them until they no longer appeared as clever conspirators, but as fragile people cornered by their own greed. For Laura, vindication was never in watching them punished. Vindication lived in her survival. She had endured the cold, the hunger, the weight of betrayal, and had emerged whole enough to tell the story. They, however, would live with the knowledge that their cruelty had been exposed under the unforgiving light of truth. Their names, once wrapped in respectability, were now tethered to whispers of abandonment and greed. When she walked through Asheville's streets once more, the city felt different beneath her feet. She carried herself not as a victim, but as someone remade by fire and ice, by betrayal and endurance. The same neighbors who once pitied her now looked with a quieter respect, sensing the strength that had been forged in silence. At night, when the city's hum faded and quiet blanketed the hills, the memory returned most vividly in sound. A distant echo unfurled in her mind, the long, mournful howl rolling across the ridges. It was not a memory of fear, but of salvation. It reminded her of the night when the wilderness itself had given her a voice, when nature refused to let her vanish. Human hands had betrayed her, but the wild had not. The betrayal had nearly ended her, yet a gray sentinel of the mountains had marked her path back to life. And every time she remembered, she felt the truth settle deeper into her bones. Her survival was not just endurance. It was retribution in its purest form. She lived, and that was the justice no one could ever strip away.